I'm so stoked that you guys are all here. Give yourselves a round of applause for coming here. Yes. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lara Swanson. Tonight we're going to talk about, for like 25 to 30 minutes, about designing for performance. After that, I'll have plenty of time for Q&A. After this talk, I've noticed that it's good to give a lot of time for Q&A just because some of this stuff can be really specific to what you're working on. We're going to cover image, font, and markup optimizations. And you can actually find all of the slides and all of the resources that I'm going to go over at laraswanson.com/design. So feel free to check it out later or right now to follow along. So I work at Etsy. Just to make sure everybody knows what Etsy is. It's a marketplace where creative people around the world connect to buy and sell unique goods. On Etsy, we currently have the ability to find unique and original products crafted by sellers from all over the world. And we have over 25 million members and more than 18 million items being sold on Etsy. We've seen tremendous growth over the past number of years. We're seeing 60 million visitors per month and 1.5 billion page views per month. So who am I? My name is Lara Swanson, and as Sergey mentioned, I'm the engineering manager for the mobile web team at Etsy. I lead a team of developers whose job it is to help other teams within Etsy learn how to build for mobile web and to not be so scared of it. And my team partners very closely with the performance team, who's responsible for doing the exact same thing, helping the feature teams make sure that whatever they're building is absolutely performant and make our site load as fast as humanly possible. So picture this. You're waiting to cross the street. You push the button and you probably do the same thing that everybody does next. You take out your phone. You've got a very short amount of time, so what do? You would check your email or Twitter, maybe follow a saved link. This short amount of time is exactly why PageSpeed is so important. You want to help your users accomplish what they need to do on your site quickly. Web performance absolutely is user experience. It's being factored into search engine results, and its effects on user behavior are being studied by major sites. You guys have probably seen these numbers before. We're talking about things in milliseconds, not even in seconds. That's how granular web performance becomes. Imagine a site as big as Google losing 20% of ad revenue and traffic due to just half a second increase in page load time. Or a site as big as Amazon. This stat compounded. Each additional 100 milliseconds decreased sales. Users are less likely to be able to complete transactions on slower websites, but also less likely to have the patience to wait. We're not just talking about revenue impact on an e-commerce site like Etsy or on Amazon. Great improvements from page load optimization apply to any kind of site. Users will return to a site that they don't have problems with, like in this study by Google Maps that saw an increase in traffic when they reduced the page weight from just 100 kilobytes to 80 kilobytes. So if you're looking for a benchmark, this is it. Users expect your pages to load in 2 seconds. And after 3 seconds, 40% of your users will abandon your site. Think about how you search for things on the web. How quick are you to close a tab and go to the next search engine result if a site takes too long to load? This is evidenced by a recent experiment that we at Etsy ran. We found an increased bounce rate of about 12% on mobile if we added just 160 kilobytes of images to a page. DoubleClick removed one client-side redirect and saw a 12% increase in click-through rate on mobile devices. So again, envision the time it takes everyone to wait for a walk signal to turn or to wait for a bus to pull up. That's the time that a user has to complete a task on your site. Is your site fast enough for a user to accomplish the one thing that you want them to do? 75% of shoppers who experience an issue like freezing, crashing, taking too long, or having a convoluted checkout process will not buy from that site. User experience will absolutely drive traffic and conversions away. Performance and user experience definitely go hand in hand. At peak traffic times, more than 56% of online consumers left for a competitor's site rather than suffer delays. So what traffic might you be losing to a competitor if your site is too slow? These numbers matter because we are designing sites with increasingly rich content, lots of dynamic elements, larger JavaScript files, beautiful animations, complex graphics, etc. We may optimize design and layout for mobile, but we don't always optimize for page speed on mobile. Some responsively designed sites are irresponsible with the amount of JavaScript and images needed to reformat a site for smaller screen sizes. That fast page load time and positive user experience will build trust in your site. You'll get more returning visitors. You'll see more users choosing you over a competitor. And you'll see more people trusting your brand. That positive user experience yields a ton of good things for you and your site, and optimized page speed is a huge part of it. Sometimes we'll make choices that favor aesthetics. Sometimes we'll make choices that favor page load time. The key is to always be thinking in terms of engagement metrics and what will have the biggest impact. So take a minute and think about your most recent design. How many different font weights did you use? How many images did you use? How large were those image files? And what file formats of those images did you use? How did your design affect the plan for CSS and HTML markup? We're going to walk through some good questions to ask yourself as you're designing your site or implementing a redesign. What value does this large hero image add? Will 3 font weights help drive conversions? What metric are we hoping will improve with this carousel? Aesthetics absolutely contribute to overall conversion rate, just like performance. That's why we should be thinking about the stuff from the design stage and benchmarking performance as we go. So we're going to cover some basic things that we're going to look for as we optimize our site. This is a good time to mention Web Page Test if you're not already familiar. This is my go-to tool for measuring performance. You can enter in any live URL and choose a geographic location and which browser you want to test. It'll show you things like waterfalls. A waterfall will show you the images and other files that make up the total page load time of your site. You can spot page load time issues by checking your site's waterfall with Web Page Test. We're also going to look at number of requests. This shows the connections made to go grab those requests and render them on your page. Browsers are smart, and they'll try to parallelize grabbing those files to show things on the page faster. The vertical green line shows when the page starts to render, and the blue line shows when the document rendering is complete. We're also aiming to optimize the size of each request. Here are some examples from Etsy of CSS and images. This is from the Etsy.com homepage. So that's how large they are, ranging from just 8K to more than 70K. The bigger each request is, the longer it'll take for the page to complete rendering. So here's what we're going to cover. These are the biggest wins for your requests: image formatting and spriting, cutting down our font weights. We're going to talk about semantic markup and repurposability with your HTML and CSS, and how to deliberately load assets for both mobile and desktop. So image formatting is arguably the most easy win, since images make up the majority of most sites' page weight. We're going to go back to basics here to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Our image file types: PNG. You're going to use it for transparency, so PNG 24, or when you have fewer colors, so PNG 8. You should use JPEGs only for when you have lots of colors. They do not support transparency. And GIFs. You really shouldn't use them because they're super heavy, and most animations can be replaced with CSS3. So when you're choosing your PNG 8 has max 256 colors, and it uses alpha transparency, and generally it has a smaller file size. It's not that you have a smaller number of colors to choose from, it's that you will max out at 256 colors in the image. I will, thank you. Thank you. So PNG 24s have prettier transparency, tons more colors, and generally a larger file size. As you get ready to export your image, test out a few different qualities and file types in the Save for Web workflow within Photoshop. I'm going to assume here that everybody's using Photoshop, but if you're not, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. Find a happy medium of quality and file size. Most find that for JPEGs, 80 to 90% quality is just fine, but it's important to play with the file size and see what looks best for you. After you've exported the image, run it through a tool like ImageOptim, which finds the best compression technique for a variety of file types. There's also Smushit, which is an online image lossless optimizer. I found that ImageOptim saves me a ton of additional file size, sometimes upward of a 30% improvement on PNGs and JPEGs. Sprites. You can also decrease the number of requests by combining images into sprites. Your page weight might get bigger because of the larger image in CSS, but it's likely that this will still have a huge impact on page speed. This is from when I was working in a company called Dyn. This area in the center had about 10 thumbnails, and we had about 40 images that we rotated in and out of them. We decided to sprite this. It actually added 60 kilobytes of page weight to the page because of the heavier image, the CSS, and the JavaScript needed to render the thumbnails. But we cut page load time by 35% by spriting it and doing it this way. So don't always be afraid of larger page weight. Sometimes, depending upon how you actually load things into your deliberative asset loading, you're going to have a huge page speed win. So good questions to ask yourself. How compressed can this image be? How many colors do I need? Do I need transparency? And can I sprite it? There's an interesting side effect to well-optimized images, and that's handset battery life. A recent study showed that if Amazon changed all of their images to compressed JPEGs, it would save 20% of the energy needed to load Amazon on a phone. And if Facebook did the same, it would have saved 30%. So when you're going through this, recognize it's affecting the entire user experience, not just web page load time. All right, so pop quiz. What file type would you use for the backgrounds on these buttons? Shout it out. I'm hearing PNG8s. What? Bingo. That was a trick question. Sorry, guys. CSS3. So we're going to talk about gradients here for a second. So gradients can handle transparency, which is why they're great replacement for PNGs. They can be overlaid on a background color, meaning you can actually have any kind of background color and have a repeating gradient over different kinds of buttons. They eliminate an image request, and they're super easy to re-edit. You can see in the CSS that we're choosing colors and the direction of the gradient. There's no image requests needed. Using CSS3 can be a great and performant replacement for images. It does require using vendor prefixes currently, but we'll get rid of those eventually once everybody gets smarter about it. So don't worry about all the extra page weight from all the vendor prefixes. You should be using gzip on your site anyway, and that'll handle all the extra markup. Even if there's more CSS, it'll still be a more performant option than an image request. You can do some pretty amazing things with CSS3 gradients. All of these things are made with CSS3. Because of the control over where the colors begin and end, they're really powerful. That being said, be careful about how your CSS affects repaint times, as there can be a cost to using a lot of CSS3. A repaint is an expensive operation, performance-wise, and can make your page look sluggish, which you ideally want to avoid. If you find that your user interface actually becomes sluggish, especially upon scrolling, you may have a CSS3 or JavaScript repainting issue, and you'll want to dig into DevTools to figure out what's causing it. So good questions to ask as you're considering CSS gradients. Can any of my images be replaced with a gradient and save an image request? Will this gradient work over multiple background colors so I can repurpose it and save markup? And is there any unfortunate UI sluggishness that could be caused by repaint times? Fonts. They are, frankly, the bane of my existence. So font files can be incredibly heavy and also very tricky to optimize for requests. It's important to pay attention to how they're affecting your page load time. Poor IE8. It's really not that smart with fonts. Even if you're not using a particular font file on a page, if it's in your CSS, it'll download all of the files. This is true for IE9 and higher with compatibility mode turned on too, so you're kind of screwed. So you really want to make sure you're only including just the fonts that you absolutely need. This has everything to do with optimizing the size and number of requests that it takes to load your page. The more font weights you use, the longer the page will take to load, because font files can be really heavy. The average font served by Google Web Fonts is about 35K, that can be upwards of 200K, depending upon the language and the character support. You can make optimizations to them using tools like Font Squirrel's font face generator to remove unnecessary characters, and this is also called character subsetting. One more advanced option is to Ajax in your CSS in a separate style sheet that declares the font. So test it and see if this happens to work for your site. So questions to ask as you're considering fonts. What font weights do I absolutely need in this design? Can they be combined or consolidated? And can I remove some of the characters to decrease the file size? So as you design a new project, semantics and the repurposability of what you design are actually tremendously important. You'll save development and page load time by thinking about the repurposability of what you're designing and by coding it so that it can be repurposed easily. Bloated HTML leads to bloated CSS and vice versa. I did this site cleanup in which simply renaming elements and cleaning up unnecessary elements, known as divitis, in order to focus on repurposability had a huge impact on HTML, CSS, and style sheet images. Naturally, this had an impact on performance too. So as you're designing and developing, ask yourself, can someone else use this pattern? Assets that get reused can get cached, which is a huge performance win. Start by naming elements by function or content, not by design. This is debated in our industry, but it's my main recommendation for a small or medium-sized site. A site as big as Facebook should absolutely use a naming pattern that's object-oriented because of its scale and how many developers are touching the code. But for your average site, being semantic with your element names can be hugely beneficial for repurposability and eliminating all those unnecessary elements in the future. Inefficient selectors tend to happen because of CSS overriding previous CSS. It tends to mean that there's something else wrong, and it could be more efficient. It used to be thought that inefficient selectors were inherently bad for performance, but that's less of a concern these days for modern browsers. It's still good to clean them up as they can help you maintain your front-end architecture. And lastly, our friend divitis. Eliminate it as much as possible. Again, this is a good indicator that there's something else wrong, so cleaning this up and making it repurposable will go a long way for page load time and development time. This is a before and after of a site cleanup using Firefox's 3D view of a page. It shows the elements used to make up the HTML hierarchy and nesting depth. The after on the right has fewer layers since we were careful about removing extraneous markup and using semantic markup. This was not a redesign. This was plain old a cleanup. So good questions to ask. Did I create a design pattern that can be repurposed? Did I use semantic element names and a good HTML hierarchy? And can my work be repurposed by someone else on another project? Everything that we already covered will help you create a performance site, whether or not you use responsive web design. However, there are some additional performance considerations when you implement responsive web. I love this graph. A result of recent client studies show that for a ton of internet users globally, mobile is the primary access method. Roughly 50% of internet users in Africa and Asia are mobile only, which is in contrast to 25% in the United States. This study called mobile only users those who never or infrequently use the desktop internet, and the study included tablets in the desktop category. So lots of people are primarily using mobile devices, and they're so much slower than desktop. Mobile performance is terrible. Before a device can transmit or receive data, it has to establish a radio channel with the network. This can take several seconds. The best part is, if there's no data transmitted or received, after a timeout, the channel will go idle, which requires a new channel to be established. This can obviously wreak havoc on your page load times. On a typical US desktop using Wi-Fi, a request average round trip takes 50 milliseconds. On a mobile network, it's more than 300. This is as slow as old dial-up connections. Responsive web design doesn't have to be bad for performance. If you start your development or design workflow by thinking about the project from a mobile-first perspective, you may be able to avoid many of the problems that bloated desktop sites face. Designing mobile-first can save you time by forcing big questions early, like what the core purpose of your page or site is, and trimming all the other cruft. As you implement responsive web design, you will make choices about your content size as it is displayed to the user. It may be fluid, it may be fixed and changed at certain breakpoints, and you may choose to simply not load assets at certain screen sizes. That's why it's important to make sure that you are only loading the assets that you truly need for a user. One approach to consider is conditional loading. You may have heard the term REST, using responsive web design combined with server-side detection. This takes into account what kind of device the user is on, what their screen size is, their touch capabilities, etc., and loads only the content that is necessary for that user to see. Adaptive Images, for example, detects your visitor's screen size and automatically creates, caches, and delivers device-appropriate, rescaled versions of your web page's embedded HTML images. Similarly, lazy loading is another technique that you can try, loading assets like images or content only when the user requires it. You deliver what's necessary above the fold for the user and lazy load the other things as the user scrolls. However, this can cause problems for screen readers, search bots, and any users with JavaScript disabled. Third-party scripts can be a single point of failure for their site if they don't load. But equally importantly, when they do load, they can drag down the performance of your site. Look at that sad, sad state of affairs. When Google Plus was transitioning from the old button to the new button, the script actually loaded both versions of the sprite, adding page load time to each page on the site where it was embedded. And from left to right there, we've got Twitter, Facebook Like, Google Plus, and the old Facebook Share buttons. There is no reason why these things need to be loaded asynchronously, or synchronously rather, always load them asynchronously. If a third party doesn't provide an asynchronous version, you should demand it. Also consider replacing them in responsive web design with simple links that don't have the overhead and are much more in your control for performance optimization. Picture fill is another technique you can use to deliver the correctly sized image to your users. It mimics the proposed picture element, requires a tiny JavaScript file, and works across all browsers. The markup looks like this. You set data source and data media attributes for each image size. Performance-wise, this is great. It provides unique image URLs which can be cached. It starts with the smallest image and requires only one image download for the user. There's even a fallback for old IE browsers. However, this markup is obviously pretty sizable and may be hard to replace in the future if browsers decide on a different universal responsive image solution. But that being said, all the other image, font, and markup optimizations we covered will also help you tremendously when you approach responsive web design. So, as you design, ask yourself, how many asset requests am I creating? Can I find a way to slim down the number of assets I'm loading? Are my images really large or not sprited? Can any be replaced with CSS3? How can I be smart about weighing aesthetics versus performance, especially when it comes to heavier assets like fonts? And what can I repurpose so that it's cache for the user or helps with divitis and the size of my markup? An additional recommendation that I have when approaching a new project is to create a performance budget, such as a total page weight limit or a total page load time goal. By creating a performance budget up front, you can have an easy baseline to refer to as you design and develop. If you say that you want the page to be loaded under 2 seconds, you can continue to play with the balance of aesthetics and performance and decide what works best to meet that goal. I also recommend that you get designs into the browser as soon as possible. Photoshop is an unrealistic way of gauging how effective the design will be once it exists in its final environment. And you can start to see how large your page weight is and how your design decisions affect performance. Lastly, continue to iterate on existing designs with performance in mind. If you want to make some aesthetic decisions that will negatively impact performance, A/B test them to see which one actually improves your engagement metrics. Continue to benchmark and iterate on performance as well as engagement metrics as you make any changes to your design. As Brad Frost says, good performance is good design. There's a ton of other improvements you can make to the back end, but 80 to 90% of performance happens on the front end. On mobile, it can be up to 97%. So optimize for good performance, and you'll have a huge leg up on creating an excellent user experience. And that's it for right now, so I'll take some questions. The question was, how do I convince a designer to improve on a feature instead of building a new one? Is that the question? What's funny, we actually have some Etsy designers here, so I hope that they're satisfied with my answer. It's an ongoing thing at any company. So at Etsy, what we do is we work with the design team and the feature team that's building out a product, and we give them kind of like an audit. So if we see something that's outlandish, something that can be improved, we usually suggest an improvement to them, and we do it in a way that actually helps them do it themselves. Teach a designer to fish, if you will. That was actually pretty good timing, considering. Over. Go for it. Great questions. The question's about web page test and if there's other tools that we use to measure performance, and also what do we do for mobile testing. So web page test, we have a private instance that we've installed at Etsy that we use we do plenty of automated tests, especially as we roll out new features. Kai's finding out if it actually to be safe, or if we can just hang out. If you guys can still hear me, I'll talk about the second part of the question, which is the mobile testing. We actually built a mobile device lab. So we have about 34 devices right now in which we conduct actual testing as we go, which is helpful to measure jank and stuff like that. It's on our local Wi-Fi. Web page test has that new Purify integration in which that you can test over different kinds of bandwidth and different devices. So we are planning on testing that out, but for right now, most of our testing for devices happens in our device lab on site. How do I feel about tools like PageSpeed and Chrome? I think that they're great for the beginner. I think that PageSpeed is really helpful for people who are just starting out, but usually for sites that are more like Etsy, where we've got a pretty good handle on performance, their baseline optimization suggestions, we've done them. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Yes, in the back. Wow, I've never gotten that one before. So the first question is about Google Analytics and what do I think about it for page load time. So I have not used Google Analytics for page load time stuff because they sample so heavily. I rely much more on things like web page test and our real user monitoring solutions. I have actually, tell me more about these glyph fonts. Are you talking about like using this for symbols and other things? Oh yeah, okay. Yes, so I'll keep on talking over this. So, oh, that's a new sound. It's much more calming. So we've been testing using fonts. That's a very clear status message. I'm really impressed. Clearly, yeah. So about glyph fonts. So we actually have been testing using these at Etsy, especially on mobile. Instead of spriting images, we're testing using an SVG font for our header icons and other kinds of icons, and seeing if that's better for performance, because you can cache them still, but also they can be resized. So on Retina screens, you still only have to load one SVG font instead of having to load a different sprite, for example. So we've been testing it, and we've been finding it generally more performant, but we want to invest more time in actually updating and moving all of our icons over to an SVG font before really investing in testing. Yes. So you're asking how many tools is enough tools, or how many tools is too little tools? So at Etsy, we graph everything all the time. It's hundreds of thousands of graphs at this point internally. So whenever we deploy something, we'll look at a whole page of just deploy graphs and include them in our web performance graphs. So we measure it in a bunch of different ways. Web pages is our primary method of using it, but absolutely pairing it with other tools to make sure that what you're looking at is on point makes a ton of sense. At what point do you stop supporting older browsers? You can't just say when you're sick of them, because, yeah. That's a really good question. So I think that we just stopped supporting IE7. I think that we've been supporting the last 2 versions of browsers at Etsy. I mean, we have a leg up on this because our users tend to not use older browsers, so it's a little bit easier for us. We actually look at user base. So we look at number of users on a particular browser, and we basically make a call to say, yep, we're comfortable not supporting older browsers. This is also equally hard for mobile browsers. So look at older Androids. They cause a lot of problems with overlays and stuff like that, and it's been very hard for us to figure out what we should and shouldn't support. So clarify devitis. So sure, so when I say devitis, I'm primarily meaning extraneous markup that serves no good purpose. Often this will happen when it's not semantic. So you'll see children, they might not even be divs. There could be lots of links. They could be an unordered list. It could be any kind of markup that's basically serving some design purpose, but could actually be a lot sexier in terms of how it's marked up to make it a lot more repurposable and semantic in the future. So typically the way you'll see this is lots of children elements. That's a huge sign of it. Things that are named like left and top are good indicators of that as well. But yeah, usually it's like if you can see a better way to do it, a more purposeful, more semantic way, that's usually an indicator that devitis is a thing. Does that help? I'm still really impressed by that status message. Yeah, that's pretty good. The mean time to resolve waterfall is pretty good here. Yeah. So the question is really about what does Etsy do in terms of semantic versus object-oriented naming patterns, especially when it comes to things like SaaS. So we've just started working with SaaS actually very recently. We're testing it out on Etsy. We haven't made a call on it yet. In general, we try to be very semantic because there's lots of people working on lots of different things and they want to repurpose modules. We actually have a style guide, an internal style guide with a lot of repurposable like overlays and loading schemes and other things like that. And for those reasons, we try to be very semantic. That way, if you include something on a page, it's not going to affect the other things that are called similar things. That being said, obviously SaaS is going to introduce some new challenges, and obviously as we scale, we've got other challenges with more developers. Bigger sites tend to use object-oriented CSS to manage with that. So I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion we're going to have. I still always advocate for like a medium to small size site. You should definitely be using semantic naming patterns. Yes, so Nicole Sullivan is a champion of this. You may want to Google Nicole Sullivan or object-oriented CSS. She'll be able to explain it much better than I can. But basically, instead of using like a div of login, you might use a div of left or right or other things to basically design-oriented or object-oriented naming patterns instead of semantics. Yeah. Nicole has a number of great articles on it. You should definitely check it out. That's what they did at Facebook. What do we use for measuring reflows or repaints? So we have been doing, so when we get like jank, I think it's still in Chrome Canary. I'm not sure if it's made it into the regular build, but there's like a frames per second meter. We've been using that primarily to basically test things. Not right now. Yeah. It's pretty manual. Am I not allowed to comment on that? No, I'm just kidding. No, so carousels are tough. Like I'm not a proponent of carousels, but you have to measure it. So on Etsy, we typically, whenever we run an experiment, we'll measure conversion rate, bounce rate, and other typical engagement metrics. Maybe favoriting if we're on a listing page or a shop home. On the home page, we're going to be measuring bounces, length of time on the site, other things like that. So as we build out the home page and continue to iterate on it, we will be measuring things like that. Yeah. Yes, there's been a huge performance impact. Yeah, so sharding, the question's about sharding and sharding assets. There's actually, if you guys go to Code is Craft, it's the Etsy blog, and all of our engineers contributed to it. There's a great post about exactly domain sharding on there you should totally check out. We definitely have seen a performance impact thanks to it. So HSing Fonts has the con of a flash of unstyled content. So you'd want to see is how much page weight additionally would be loaded before that happens. So it's basically testing on your site. And testing using a tool like Web Page Test to make sure that you're not getting too much of a flash of unstyled content before the AJAX request calls in that new style sheet. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis in terms of like what you're already loading on the site, how large your above the fold content is, things like that. That would be a case in which it might not be beneficial. So the question is about how do you measure, or what do you think about qualitative versus quantitative performance measuring? So qualitative obviously is going to be much more difficult to talk about than like the data, and Etsy relies on data pretty heavily. We do a lot of user testing. So like we'll have a team come in and work with us in the apps, for example. Things like that we'll measure time to glass is very different than time to interactivity. So obviously user feedback will have a huge part like qualitatively in like it may be performant as far as numbers go. Like we may get it to the glass really fast, but what if you can't actually scroll or touch anything right away? How frustrating is that for a user? Similarly, we're running an experiment soon in which we deliver 14K of assets immediately. So we're going to inline CSS and see how that improves because the first TCP request gets 14K. And we're going to see if that makes a huge impact on user experience versus just how fast the page loads. Does that answer your question? Yeah, again, because it's user experience, it really comes down to like talking to our users, which we do a lot of. Business metrics totally talk to, but they don't tell the whole story necessarily. No, sure, yeah. I mean, it's basically what do we have to work with? Totally. That's a great question. So it's how do we handle user-generated images? So we actually just implemented a new tool we're starting to test out in which we have dynamically generated image sizes. So we're able to start saying at this screen resolution, we want to serve up this image size. So we're storing all the images, but then dynamically creating other versions of the images. Server-side, yep. So the question's about a new designer or somebody who hasn't thought about this before. How do you work on convincing them of the importance of performance? So it's a great question. So at Etsy, thankfully, we've got a culture of performance. It comes from top down. I mean, Chad, our CEO, is heavily performance oriented. So thankfully, when people are onboarding, it's usually part of the culture and part of the things that we talk about. We do a couple of other things. We have boot camps in which people, mostly engineers, can boot camp with other teams around the company when they first get onboarded into the company, and so they can actually sit with performance and work with them. We also do design bug rotations in which designers can come on and work through a bunch of bugs, whether it's performance, whether there's like a little weird thing happening with design, to actually improve that stuff. So we've got a number of different teams working with designers on performance stuff to make sure it's like constantly part of our culture. It works for Etsy. At other places where I've worked, it helps to put page load time up on a monitor to say like, hey, look what we're at. We're proud of this 500 millisecond page load time. And there's something about that culture of like talking about it all the time that really helps. I do not think that it impacts or inhibits the creativity of the person. The stuff that I've been able to do, have you guys ever been to CSS3 Geometry Daily? I curate this site called CSS3 Geometry Daily, in which I recreate images using just CSS3. CSS3 is so powerful. I mean, the things that we can do with nowadays are pretty amazing. So at least personally, I haven't found it impacting. Maybe it's because I have a performance mindset anyway. And you could probably talk to the other Etsy designers that are in the room to ask them what they really think about what I'm saying. But yeah, I haven't found that it actually negatively impacts it. Yeah, we roll our own framework is the question, yeah. We have been testing out a couple of different frameworks right now for performance and for repurposability, because what we want to implement is going to work across multiple feature teams, not just one feature team. It's a lot harder when one feature team wants to implement something and kind of roll their own. So we've been testing out a bunch of different libraries, actually. A lot of different libraries. So we're basically in a testing phase. We're not ready to like commit to any one of them yet. Yeah. We do measure performance of JavaScript. All the ones mentioned. So web page tests. We also, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So A/B tests. How do we handle libraries and single points of failure when it comes to running experiments? So we roll our own. Yeah. So we actually, yeah, we don't import any libraries to run it. We actually set some cookies, and we collect data that way. Yeah. So sorry, I don't have any tips on the good libraries for A/B testing. Sure. I think we've open sourced some of it, actually. You should check out our GitHub and see what we've open sourced there. Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. This has been awesome. I'm going to be hanging out, so feel free to ask me more questions.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you.